The medieval word for a toilet also meant your closet. Same word. A garderobe was a small room off a wealthy person's bedchamber where they kept their expensive clothing, and it is the direct ancestor of the modern word wardrobe. It also meant the place you went to relieve yourself. Those were not two rooms that happened to share an unlucky name. They were frequently the same room, on purpose, and the reason is one of the more practical things anyone did in the entire Middle Ages. A good cloak could cost more than a farm labourer earned in a year, so clothing was money you wore on your back. Moths and lice ate money, and it turns out the ammonia rising off a pit of stale urine is very good at killing moths and lice, so people hung their best robes right by the latrine shaft and let the fumes do the work. The stink was the feature. Your winter cloak made it to spring because it spent the cold months hanging over a hole full of human waste. So where did all that waste actually go? Start with Bodiam Castle in East Sussex, finished in the 1380s. It is the castle from the postcards, a tidy square of round towers standing in the middle of a wide moat, the water flat as a mirror. That mirror was also the drain. Bodiam had 28 toilets, and every one of them emptied straight into the moat you're admiring. In August, downwind, the prettiest castle in England was a lake of sewage with a fortress parked in the middle of it. The honest version of this history is that medieval castles handled their waste with genuine engineering, that the same engineering killed people with grim regularity, and that the deaths everyone remembers happening on a toilet are mostly invented. That last part is where most of the fun is. The device itself was clever in a way it gets no credit for. A garderobe was a small chamber built to hang off the outside of the castle wall, held up on stone brackets called corbels, so the seat inside perched over open air. You went through a hole cut in a wooden bench, and it dropped. Sometimes a few feet into a pit at the base of the wall, sometimes most of the height of the wall, down a masonry chute run through the stone. Builders did not put these just anywhere. They tucked them into the corner where a tower met the main curtain wall, where the masonry was thickest and could carry the extra load without weakening the defences. Inside, the good ones were not grim at all. The walls were whitewashed with lime plaster, which bounced light around a windowless space and killed a bit of bacteria into the bargain. The floor got fresh rushes and herbs. Some had a little unshuttered window for air. Some were built with a right-angle turn at the door so nobody outside could see in. Old Sarum had a royal one floored with straw that was, by the standards of the day, a luxury. This was a designed room, not a hole in the ground. The people using these rooms were not the unwashed savages of popular imagination either. Medieval people washed constantly, a daily going over of the face, hands, underarms and groin, and they changed their underclothes often. Full immersion baths were rarer, because filling a big wooden tub meant servants hauling hot water by hand, which cost fuel and labour, not because anyone believed washing was bad for you. King John of England travelled with his own bathtub and a man whose entire job was to run it. The reputation for filth comes later, after the Black Death, when people got frightened that hot water and open pores let the plague in. That fear got smeared backward across the whole 1,000 years. Now, some of the specific solutions castles came up with are genuinely funny. Orford Castle in Suffolk, built in the second half of the 12th century, has triangular urinals set right into the wall passages so a sentry on watch would not have to leave his post. You could keep an eye on the approach road and empty your bladder without stepping away from it. Peveril Castle skipped the cesspit problem entirely by hanging its garderobe over a cliff edge, so the waste simply fell into the chasm and nobody ever cleaned a thing. St Andrew's Castle in Scotland pulled the same trick with the sea, corbelling its toilet out over the cliff so everything dropped straight into the water, and it was positioned with real care so the waste landed just barely outside the wall and not on the rocks directly below. The French took the idea and made it elegant. The keep at the Château de Vincennes had a latrine tower roughly 5 metres by 6, with a toilet on every single floor, its interior fully panelled in wood, which was unusually refined for the job. Every floor's seat fed one shared vertical shaft that dropped into a single pit in the basement. From the 14th century onward, that became the pattern everyone copied. Stack the toilets, share the shaft, collect at the bottom, dig it out later. That stacking is why so many castle ruins look, from outside, like they have a column of little windows climbing one corner. Those are toilets. Dover Castle had tiers of them on the keep's outer wall, all draining to one cesspit at the base you could reach from outside so cleaners never had to come indoors to empty it. Henry II had an ensuite off his own bedchamber there. Langley Castle in Northumberland, built around 1350, still has 12 garderobes surviving in a single tower, one of the densest concentrations left anywhere in Europe, and its collection pit was flushed by a stream someone had deliberately diverted through it. Norwich Castle packed 4 latrine compartments into one wall that could seat 16 people at once, over a sloped surface that walked everything down to a pit for shovelling out by hand. The best single piece of medieval toilet engineering, though, belongs to the Teutonic Knights. At Malbork Castle in Poland, they built a thing called a Dansker. It is a completely detached tower standing out over the River Nogat, connected to the main castle only by a long raised covered walkway with its own drawbridge. You walked out of the fortress, across a fortified bridge, into a separate tower, and that tower was the toilet. It doubled as a defensive strongpoint with slots for archers, so at the worst possible moment your bathroom was also a bunker. The design worked well enough that other Teutonic castles copied it, and Malbork is a World Heritage Site that now cheerfully advertises the thing as its toilet tower. The Crusaders managed something similar in scale, but plumbed. Krak de Chevaliers in Syria had a dedicated latrine tower, with about a dozen toilets, a ground floor row of 12 and a separate row of 4, all feeding down a vertical conduit. One long hall had 4-seat latrines fed by a piped current of water that actually flushed them, draining into a shaft as much as 11 metres deep. That is far closer to plumbing than anything in an English castle of the same century. The Crusaders picked it up in the Levant, where the local engineering was routinely ahead of anything waiting for them back home. Back to that moat, because there is a myth here that deserves killing. People love the idea that a sewage moat was a defensive feature, that the reek and the filth were a deliberate deterrent, a ring of liquid horror to turn attackers back. It was nothing of the sort. Medieval castles and towns already smelled foul by any modern measure, and a contaminated moat was just an unavoidable byproduct of having nowhere better to put the waste. The moat kept attackers out for reasons that had nothing to do with smell. Murky water hid its own depth and whatever waited under the surface, which often meant sharpened stakes. Silt and mud dragged at anyone trying to wade or swim. A man stuck halfway across a moat is a man holding still while archers on the wall take their time with him. The better-built castles ran fresh water through continuously to stop the moat going stagnant, which tells you the engineers understood the health risk and were trying to cut it down, not turn it into a weapon. Someone had to empty all of this, and the men who did held one of the strangest jobs in medieval Europe. They were called Gong Farmers, from the Old English word gang, meaning to go, which covered both the privy itself and what came out of it. The work was to climb down into the cesspit and dig the waste out by hand, into buckets, hauled up on ropes, carted off in the dark. By Tudor law they could only work at night. A regulation from 1562 fixed their hours from 9 at night to 5 in the morning, precisely so a cart of human waste would never be seen or smelled by the public in daylight. The surprising part is the money. It paid extremely well. In 14th-century London, a skilled gong farmer could clear 4 shillings in a single night, at a time when an ordinary labourer made about 3 pence in a whole day. Work 3 nights a week and you out-earned a master carpenter, a stonemason, or a minor priest. Later the going rate was around 2 shillings for every ton of waste removed. At Hampton Court under Elizabeth I, the pay was 6pence a day, called a good living for the period. Some were paid partly in beeswax candles and brandy, which starts to make grim sense once you think about what the candles and the brandy were for. For all the money, nobody wanted them close. Gong farmers were made to live apart from everyone else, shut out of the craft guilds, avoided in the street. There is a London record of one who got rid of waste improperly by pouring it down a drain. His punishment was to be lowered into one of his own waste pipes, packed to the neck in the exact substance he had spent his life digging out, and put on public display on Golden Lane. The medieval sense of justice had a real feel for the fitting. The job killed people, and not gently. The danger was gas. A cesspit that has sat sealed and stewing throws off hydrogen sulfide and methane, and one deep breath of it drops a person before they register that anything is wrong. The experienced men lowered a lit candle into the pit first. If the flame went out, the air down there would kill you, and you did not follow it. In 1326, a London gong farmer called Richard the Raker drowned in a cesspit when its rotted covering gave way while he was working under it. The same year a man named Thomas Witt suffocated cleaning a pit beneath a London church, and the man who climbed down to pull him out died within minutes of reaching him. That is the vicious thing about this kind of death. The rescuer breathes the same air and dies the same way, so a single failure takes 2 men instead of 1. The waste did not only kill the men who handled it. Once in a while it killed the people it was built for, and one time it did so on a scale that is genuinely hard to picture. On the 26th of July, 1184, King Henry VI held a court assembly in a building beside the cathedral in Erfurt, in what is now Germany, to mediate a land quarrel between 2 powerful men. A crowd of nobles packed into an upper room. That room sat directly over the building's cesspit. The floor beams were rotten, and under the combined weight of the assembled aristocracy of the region, they snapped. The floor gave way, then the ground floor beneath it gave way too, and dozens of men dropped straight into the pit of sewage below. Around 60 of them died, some crushed, some drowned in it, some killed by the fumes. Counts and burgraves were among the dead, named in the record. Henry VI himself lived only because he scrambled into a stone window alcove and clung there with a handful of others until someone fetched ladders. This is a real event, set down in the chronicle of the local monastery. The most powerful men in the region gathered to argue about a piece of land, and the room dropped them into a sewer. None of this waste was worthless, which is the part people miss. It got collected and sold because it was raw material for half a dozen trades. Farmers bought it as fertilizer, and actually preferred it to animal dung since it carried fewer weed seeds. Tanners used dog droppings to soften hides, a step the trade called puring, and sent children door to door to gather it up. Clothmakers needed stale urine, left to sit a week or two until it turned to ammonia, to strip the grease out of raw wool, and by 1300 England ran around 15 million sheep, roughly 3 times the human population, so the appetite for urine was not a small thing. The strangest use of all was gunpowder. Gunpowder needs potassium nitrate, saltpeter, and the best source the medieval world had was earth that had spent years soaking up urine and dung. So the crown kept men called saltpeter men with legal authority to walk into your stable, your dovecote, your pigeon house, even the floor of your parish church, and dig out the nitrogen-rich soil to boil down for gunpowder. Charles I ordered households to save their livestock urine and hand it over daily. There was a court case about the whole business in 1606, and the ruling by Sir Edward Coke held that the crown genuinely did have the right to come dig up your dirt because saltpeter was an inseparable part of the crown's power. The saltpeterman could not undermine your walls or tear up the floor of the room you slept in, but the soil under your pigeons belonged in practice to the king's guns. An entire country's waste was a strategic military resource, which brings us to the kings, because a surprising number of powerful men in the Middle Ages met their end on or near a toilet, and telling the true stories from the invented ones is its own small history lesson. The best documented of the lot is James I of Scotland. On the night of the 20th of February, 1437, at the Blackfriars Monastery in Perth, a party of roughly 30 conspirators arrived to murder him. His own chamberlain had let them in and drawn the bolts from the doors in advance. Here is where it turns almost unbearably ironic. James loved court tennis, and he kept losing the balls down a drain that ran off his chamber. It irritated him so much that just 3 days earlier he had personally ordered the outer mouth of that drain sealed up with stone. When the killers came through the door, James pried up the floorboards and dropped into that same drain to escape, and found it blocked. By his own command from 3 days before, he was trapped in a dead end he had built himself, and they stabbed him to death in it. His wife, Queen Joan, was wounded but got away, which mattered, because her escape protected the succession of their son. There is a famous detail, almost certainly embellished, that a lady-in-waiting named Catherine Douglas shoved her own arm through the empty brackets where the door bar should have been and had it broken trying to hold the door shut. Fine story. The core of the account, the tennis balls and the drain he blocked himself, is solid. 2 more are real. Godfrey the Hunchback, Duke of Lower Lorraine, was stabbed from below while sitting on the toilet at Vlaardingen, in what is now the Netherlands, in 1076. He did not die fast. He lingered about a week before dying at Utrecht, and the killing carried serious political weight because he was a key ally of the emperor, and in 1306 Wenceslaus III of Bohemia, the last male of the Przemyslid line that had ruled for roughly 400 years, 16 years old, was stabbed several times in the Garderobe while pulling together an army to invade Poland. His killer was never identified. A knight was beaten to death by the guards on the spot without any trial, and even people at the time doubted they had the right man. A single killing in a toilet ended a 400-year dynasty, and nobody ever established for certain who did it. Now the invented ones, which are just as telling. Edmund Ironside, King of England, died in 1016 after a savage year of war against Cnut. The popular story is gruesome. It has an assassin hiding inside the privy pit beneath him and stabbing upward through the seat twice, leaving the dagger buried in the wound. The trouble is that the earliest and best source, the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, gives no cause of death at all. The murder does not appear until Henry of Huntingdon writes it down more than a century later. A few decades after that, a writer named Geoffrey Gaillard takes the same tale and inflates it into a booby-trapped crossbow rigged inside the air spit that fires the instant the king sits. One historian dismissed Gaillard as so riddled with errors as to be useless, which is generous. Edmund almost certainly died of natural causes or of wounds from his campaign. The latrine assassination grew in the retelling, getting more elaborate and more mechanical each time somebody copied it out. The same rigged machine motif turns up in the death of Kenneth II of Scotland, lured to a cottage at Fettercairn, supposedly fitted with a statue wired to crossbows that fired when he touched it. Also a fable, grafted onto a real assassination. Medieval writers could not resist a hidden death machine, which leaves the single most repeated toilet fact in all of castle history, the one you have probably heard, the one about the castle that fell because of its latrine. Chateau Gaillard was Richard the Lionheart's masterpiece, a cliff-top fortress above the Seine at Leandely in Normandy, finished in 1198. In 1204 it fell to the French king Philip Augustus, and losing it effectively ended English rule in Normandy. The famous version says French soldiers found an unguarded latrine chute, climbed up it in the dark, came out inside the castle through a toilet, made enough racket to convince the garrison a whole force had broken in, and dropped the drawbridge for the army, a fortress undone by its own plumbing. It is a perfect story. It is also almost certainly false. The actual contemporary account, an epic Latin poem by Philip Augustus's own chaplain, a man alive and present through the rain, says the soldiers got in through one of the low windows of the chapel. Not a latrine, a chapel window. French historians have spent a long time pointing out that the toilet version keeps getting repeated as fact by popular books and websites that never check the primary source. There is even a fair theory for why the plumbing story stuck. Climbing in through a toilet is funny and it sticks in the memory, while the true version, soldiers breaking into a consecrated chapel to win a battle for a king who claimed to rule by God's own authority, was theologically awkward. A toilet made a more comfortable culprit than a desecrated chapel. So, the plumbing took the blame. The story being false did not stop it from having real consequences, because later builders clearly fretted about the weakness, whether or not anyone had ever exploited it. They fitted iron grates into garderobe shafts. They narrowed the chutes. At Peveril they hung the toilet over a cliff so there was nothing to climb in the first place. At Ballymoon Castle in Ireland they covered 2 garderobe chutes with metal grids running all the way to the ground for no other reason than to stop somebody climbing up through the toilet. The fear was real, even in places the event never was. There is one more thing worth understanding, which is how completely the toilet mapped onto class. A private garderobe off the Lord's own chamber was a status marker. Down at the bottom, soldiers and servants shared a communal pit. At Conisbrough Castle, the Lord, the garrison and the servants all had latrines. The difference was not whether you had one, it was which one you were allowed to use. At the very top, the intimacy turned into power. The English court kept an official called the Groom of the Stool, whose literal job was to attend the king while he used the toilet. He helped the king dress and undress, ran the royal privy purse, and monitored the king's bowel movements as a kind of informal health report. It sounds like the worst posting at court. It was one of the most powerful. Nobody else alive got that much private daily unwatched time with the king, and access like that is the entire game in a royal court. The men who held it were sons of the nobility, and the office made careers. The kings themselves used a close stool, a padded box with a lidded seat over a removable chamber pot, carried from palace to palace with the rest of the royal furniture. Henry VIII's was upholstered in black velvet and sheepskin, studded with gilt nails, a pewter pot inside, and its own leather travel case. That padded velvet box sat, when the court was in residence, on top of one of the grimmer facilities in England. Hampton Court had a communal latrine Henry built to seat 28 people at once, right beside the Thames, a long bench of holes with no partitions between them. After a typical 4-week royal visit, the brick cesspits underneath filled up head-high, and the work of scrubbing them out fell to boys called gong scourers. The palace of the most powerful man in England ran on velvet at the top, and children shovelling waste at the bottom. Here is where you would expect the story to turn into steady improvement. It did not, at least not for a long time. Versailles, built centuries after castles had already worked out the garderobe, had no real waste system at all for its thousands of residents. Courtiers used chamber pots, relieved themselves in the stairwells, and the staff pitched the contents out of windows. The palace kept orange trees everywhere, mostly to fight the smell. A working flush toilet was invented by John Harrington in 1596, then more or less ignored for almost 200 years, until Alexander Cumming patented the S-bend in 1775. The castle builders who hung a stone box off a wall and ran a stream through the pit below were, in a plain and measurable way, ahead of the palace that replaced them, and the gong scourer scrubbing a cesspit by candlelight was doing the same job in the same dark that a boy had done 400 years earlier.